Welcome to the Daily Insider here on Vegas Insider. I am Kevin Rogers. Thursday, December 9th, 2021. And we will take a look at the Steelers and the Vikings. Thursday night football tonight for Minnesota. Big game for both these teams. Vikings coming off that terrible loss to the Lions in the final seconds last week. The Steelers rallied past the Ravens. So we'll talk about that game. Also look ahead to Army and Navy on Saturday afternoon in New Jersey. We got a lot to discuss with Vince Akins, who is also coming off a 10-0 Sunday in the NFL. And he's going to join us in just a few moments to talk some trends for the upcoming weekend. Also hitting on the NBA for tonight, as there's 3 games on the docket, 3 pretty intriguing games. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. First, BetMGM. They are the king of sports books. New players only. Bet $10 to win $200 if your team scores a touchdown. Bet on any NFL money line. And if your team scores a touchdown, you'll receive an additional $200 in free bets. Again, new players only. Must be 21 years or older. Legal in Arizona, New Jersey, Indiana, Colorado, Tennessee, West Virginia, Iowa, Virginia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Washington, D.C. only. Full terms and conditions apply. That is BetMGM. They are the king of sportsbooks. Vince Akins, 10-0 last Sunday, Vince. Before we get to the trends, we'll get to that. We'll get to the important stuff, but more importantly, 10-0. You have never gone 10-0 in your life. Is that fair to say on one Sunday?
Yeah, that is true. I definitely have had a couple of 7-0s before. I believe an 8-0 once, but never 10-0. So that was pretty good, and it was fun sitting out that Chiefs game on Sunday night, looking for the 10-0. Unfortunately, I don't necessarily recommend parlaying all my plays for weeks. So unfortunately, there was no big 10-game parlay sitting on it. But 10-0 that. You'll take that every time. It balances out. You a couple 4 and 5 weeks and things like that, and all of a sudden 10-0, I'll make up for those real quick.
But I'm looking at what you did last week. You had 1, 2, 3. You had 4 unders. So you're basically sitting there counting the time, counting the seconds going off to try to get those. And in all reality, you were pretty set in that Baltimore-Pittsburgh game. You got kind of saved, I think, with Harbaugh going for the 2 to avoid overtime. You didn't need to deal with that, but Giants-Dolphins was pretty much no doubt about under. Colts-Texans, you had a shutout there. Tampa Bay-Atlanta did stay under. Tampa Bay kept scoring. But what was your favorite play of the day you had last Sunday, or the one that you felt the best about and it hit?
Sure. The biggest 2 plays of the week last week, it was the Steelers game, the Steelers covering, and the Seahawks. Obviously, they both were huge as far as systems go and some trends. Things we talk about here. So those were my top 2 plays of the week, along with that Giants-Dolphins under that you mentioned there. And then for the Seahawks, that was really an all-in game, and I think you saw it in the performance, even with that interception at the goal line. That could have even been a bigger win if Garrett Everett didn't kick the ball to the 49ers in that game. The Steelers, that was exactly the kind of game that we expected, a low-scoring game where those 4.5 points were a value, and that was definitely the case there. And then that Giants-Dolphins game, there's some really good team trends about the Dolphins as a favorite, play conservative games. But that's exactly what you saw in that Giants-Dolphins matchup. Was the Dolphins pretty much controlled things throughout. The first half was tight, but played things very conservative to the best against a team with Mike Glenn at quarterback. That wasn't really moving the ball with any consistency.
It's funny about that Seattle game, before we move on to the trends for the week, that I had them against Washington, and it was just so frustrating watching Russell Wilson with that offense. And finally, they scored last week, and if they didn't have that silly fumble when they were trying to put the game away, but Seattle's offense finally busted out. I'm glad you took them, because I just didn't have the faith to take the Seahawks, because they had just been so bad the last few weeks. But you had to figure they were going to get one of these games as a home dog sooner or later.
Yeah, and honestly, I'm sort of in the same boat where I had them in that Monday night game too. That was a super frustrating game. They could not have looked worse performance-wise in that game. It was one of those situations where, doing the analysis for the week, this was actually, might have been one of the best plays of the year, looking strictly at the trends systems. Downgraded a little bit based on eye test performance, but it was still a very strong play with us. One of those where the data analysis was so overwhelming that you couldn't overlook it going into that game.
Now let's look at this week. Tonight, you have Steelers-Vikings in Minnesota, and Adam Thielen's not playing for the Vikings. He's out. There are reports Dalvin Cook will give it a go. The shoulder injury, they're going to test it out in pregame. But regardless, Minnesota coming off just an inexcusable loss to Detroit. And I know the Lions have been close a lot of times this year, Vince. But then on the flip side, Pittsburgh, you had them last week against Baltimore. Now quick turnaround going on the road against the Vikings. And the Vikings, you have no idea what you get from them week in and week out. But what'd you dig up on this game?
Sure. I'll first start with, I don't know that I would worry too much about that Dalvin Cook injury if you're looking at this game one way or the other. I actually think Alexander Madison is almost, 90, 95% of what Dalvin Cook gives them, even when Cook's at full strength. So looking at a couple of trends and systems in this game, we talked about the being on the Steelers last week, not nearly as heavily on that game with a full selection. Steelers either way here today, but a couple of interesting nuggets here on the spread. First, I have teams, this goes back 2010, teams that are above 500, at least 11 games, or at least game 11 in the season, so past 10 games of the season, above 500, good sample size there, but with a negative point differential on the year. Those teams are just 41 and 65 against the spread, just covering just 38.7% of the time. Pittsburgh very much falls in this category at 6-5-1 on the season, but minus 42 on the year with their point differential. So, point differential is one of those more analytical looking things when we talk about Pythagorean record and some of those things. So Pittsburgh staying a game above 500, but it being outscored by 42 points, that's a pretty negative indicator that has showed up in the against the spread performance with those teams covering less than 39% of the time. I believe that's 1 in 4 so far this season. The Browns were active once in that Ravens game. Pittsburgh's been active once, I believe. The Raiders and Chargers have been sitting around that number as well with negative point differentials. So looking at one team trend for this game as well. This one goes back 2011. The Vikings coming off at 1 to 3 point loss, 16-4 against the spread over that time. I know sometimes it feels like the Vikings play more 1 to 3 point losses than other teams. That's actually not been the case looking back the last decade or so. But already this year, Minnesota 3-0 against the spread with this active. So this is the fourth time. You talked about that 29-27 inexcusable loss in the final play last week. So the fourth time this year they've lost by 1 to 3 points. They're already 3-0 against the spread this year. They covered against Arizona, covered against the Chargers, and covered against Seattle earlier this season in the spot already.
They've been so close, Minnesota. I mean, so many times you could say about this team. They are the NFC Chargers. That's what it feels like. Cincinnati in week 1, Dalvin Cook fumbled in overtime in Cincinnati territory. The Cardinals game, they lost in that 30-something yard field goal that they missed wide. The Baltimore game in overtime, they blew. I mean, the Detroit game, this team should be in the playoffs right now, but they're not.
Particularly in the NFC. I mean, you look at the teams fighting for the 6th and 7th seed, and it's almost up. We'll see what happens tonight. Obviously, some favorable trends on the Vikings as favorites, but it's hard to believe they're not going to get one of the 6th or 7th seeds in the NFC. Even still, looking at some of the teams they're going against: Washington, Carolina, Atlanta. Some of the teams they're fighting there.
Now let's look at college football, Vince, for this upcoming Saturday. Only one game. It's Navy and Army and Navy, however you want to phrase it. They're playing in New Jersey at MetLife Stadium, and Army is listed as a 7.5 point favorite. But the key number here, you see that down there, 34.5. But yet these teams run the ball all the time. They bleed clock, and they're always 17-10 games. It feels like every year. But what do you have with this one? You think you're going to see another under between these two teams?
It's interesting as we dig into the data here that this total is so low. Obviously, we're going to talk about some huge under trends and systems related to these teams in this game. But just to start with it, that you got the total list at 34.5 here. I've seen numbers even lower than that this week. We have total data going back 2006. This is the 16th season. There's only been one other FBS game with a total under 35. So this game may end up falling by the end of the week as the lowest recorded total going back at least 16 years. That game was a classic Missouri-Vanderbilt matchup in 2015 that we all remember, of course. Vanderbilt won 10-3. But looking at just games with totals under 37, this goes back to the last 16 years. Those games are just 3-13 over under. So 13 of the 16 games, totals under 37. Have hit the under. I believe just one. You think about Army-Navy. Only one of those games was an Army-Navy matchup. But we talk about, I think everyone or most people here know by now the 15 straight unders in this matchup, obviously something that's driving this low total. And we've expanded this further, looking at Service Academy matchups. I know I've mentioned this at least once, if not twice, on the show already this season. Service Academy matchups going back those 15 plus years, 937 over that time. So it's not just been the Army Navy. Obviously, Army Navy's been a big driver of that. Also, when you think about similar style games playing Air Force, either of these teams have driven a significant amount of unders over this time. So interesting. I looked at low total games for these teams. Navy's actually only played 3 games over the last 16 years with total under 41, which actually kind of surprised me looking at that, think about how low this total is. But they've played 3 games with totals under 41, going back 16 years here. They've actually all come in the last 3 seasons. One already this season, a 2018 game, a 2020 game. Navy has not won or covered any of those 3 games, and all 3 have gone under. Navy's actually scored a combined 13 points in those 3 games. So 3 lowest total games they've ever played, all coming in the last 3 years. Navy's combined for, or I should say averaged 4.3 points per game in those contests. Finally, looking specifically at this rivalry again, a couple of interesting nuggets. Obviously, the unique game. This is just the second straight time Army has been favored. You see that 7.5 point spread. The line was very similar, 7.5 last year. But it's just the third time since 2002 that Army's been favored in this matchup. So it's been a recent flip. Navy was favored for years and years there in this matchup. And speaking of that, pretty interestingly, you think about this. Maybe the biggest of rivalry games. You think about underdogs and performing well in such games. This goes back to 1991. 1991 was the last time an underdog of 5 or more points has won outright in this game. So since then, the favorite 5+ points has won outright 19 straight times when there hasn't been tight lines in this game. 19 times a favorite of 5 or more points is won outright. So you think about, potential money line, potential we're sitting with the spread, a potential parlay if that's something that you're considering this weekend. This has not been a matchup where the underdog has pulled off any big upsets, and going back 30 years now.
And looking back even to last year, Vince, Army won 15-0 against Navy. And looking at the losing teams over the years, 7, 7, 10, 13, 17, 17, 10, 7. So obviously you're not even getting to the 20s if you're losing. I mean, if you're winning this game, you hope to get to 20, and that's enough because you know what? No one's winning this game even, 24-21. You see how low these totals are. And even another point, too, I want to bring up. Army against Air Force this year, under 38. That game went to overtime, 21-14. Navy against Air Force, 23-3 loss, under 40. So don't be afraid to take the under, I guess, in these games.
Yeah, even with, you consider this, the totals in this game has not been nearly as low as they've dropped the last couple of years. But even looking back the last 10 years or so, if you consider this total 34.5, there would be more unders than overs. It's not the hit rate that we're talking about with this 15 straight unders. But there would still be more unders than overs just looking at that 34.5 number.
All right, let's look at the NFL now. A couple games for Sunday. Raiders and the Chiefs. And the last time these teams played out in Vegas, Kansas City destroyed Las Vegas. That was the Patrick Mahomes get-right game as he threw the ball over the place against Las Vegas, and they beat the Raiders. Now the Chiefs host the Raiders coming up, laying 9.5, and the Raiders coming off this tough loss to Washington this past week. The Chiefs have heated up, and they also have been great defensively. Now let's see if they can do this again. They were laying 2 at Vegas. Now they're laying 9.5. Vince.
Yeah, interestingly, it seems like that game might have been the defense's get-right game for the Chiefs. They've been outstanding on the defensive side of the ball the last 3 weeks now, 3 games, starting with that Raiders game. So I pulled up a couple interesting things, considering that first matchup and when that happened on the calendar, and a couple of things for each team. So first, I want to look at, that game was 4 weeks ago now. The Chiefs have had a bye since then, but that matchup 41-14 happened in week 10. So looking at teams that defeated an opponent by by at least 20 points no more than 5 weeks ago. So we're talking about recent blowout between 2 teams. The team that won that game by 20+ points in the second matchup is 58-41 against the spread. So nearly 59% against the spread in that second matchup. So you think about teams blown out recently, maybe you're thinking revenge. It's actually gone the other way, and the team off the big win, generally favored in that second matchup, have done well against the spread, even after the first big win against his opponent. So looking at each of these teams facing a team that they either lost or defeated big. The Raiders, this one goes back to 2012. They're 0-7 against the spread, facing a team they lost to by more than 14 points the first time they matched up in the season. So looking at those divisional opponents that they lost to big in the first meeting by more than 14 points, have not covered the spread in any of the 7 instances going back 2012, facing them the second time later in the year. Chiefs, on the other hand, this one recently, 2016, they're 5-1 against the spread, facing a team that they beat by at least 10 points in the first meeting. Chiefs won big, week 10 there. Each of those teams, the Chiefs have performed well and should be set to perform well in the second matchup. The Raiders have not done very well in these type second matchups in the AFC West meetings.
Yeah, basically the Raiders, we get caught in that trap a lot, Vince. Vegas lost the first time around, so they have revenge in their minds. But if they don't play well in that second matchup, but over the years, it's shown that they just don't play well in that second time around. I mean, they are getting a lot of points, and the Raiders have been good as a road underdog this year. It's just about now you're catching a Kansas City team that blew out Denver last week. I know the offense wasn't great, but the defense has stepped up. And Vegas, they have won at Dallas, they've won at Denver, they've won at Pittsburgh, but very curious to see now, those numbers, they don't favor the Raiders, but it's very curious to see that if those trends hold up or if the Raiders here can keep this a game.
Yeah. I think a lot of that's going to come down to the Vegas offensive side of the ball and the KC defense. KC's defense can play the way they have the last 3 weeks. I think that you see these kind of big spreads being covered, but if their defense is just average, below average, I think the Raiders can still score enough, and even if they don't win this game, to cover this kind of number.
All right, the Bills and the Buccaneers, Vince, and Buffalo on Monday night. They didn't have the game plan New England had. Run. Mac Jones threw the ball 3 times, and that was enough for the Patriots to beat the Bills. Now New England is in control of the AFC East, and Buffalo is just playing for their playoff lives at this point. Getting 3.5. We know Tom Brady has destroyed the Bills throughout his career. Buffalo, though, second time as a dog this year. They won at Kansas City earlier this year as a dog. So you're getting them in this rare spot. Tampa Bay undefeated at home. What do you got with the Bucs and the Bills?
Sure. And first off, I won 10 games on Sunday and lost the Monday Nighter on the Bills. So I'm going to complain a little bit. I didn't talk about those game plans. Do not understand why the Bills did not run Josh Allen in that game. I mean, you have a quarterback with that kind of skill set, big, strong, can be a runner. And, this is the kind of game, a Monday night game for the division lead late in the season. That's the kind of game that you save, Josh Allen running the ball for. I understand when you don't want to do it, week 6 playing the Jaguars or playing the Texans. But, against the Patriots for the division league in week 12, windy game, do not understand why they did not run Josh Allen in that game. Anyhow, moving on to this week's action. So you mentioned that the Bills won and as a lone dog already this season. Actually, going back to last season, as a regular season underdog, they're 4-0 against the spread. Going back to the middle of last season, November, won 3 of those 4 games outright. I pulled that up because we're going to talk about the totals here in this game. You see it at 53.5 there. Starting with the Bills as an underdog, they've gone over the last 5 games played as an underdog, including the playoff game last year, and that goes back to November 2020. So just last year, as an underdog, the Bills have been aggressive. When you think about the way Josh Allen's played in some of those performances, they've performed well, obviously, straight up in those games. They have been aggressive, leading to 5 overs in those games. The same thing holds true for the Bills in games with high totals. So I looked at games with totals over 52. The Bills, this is historically 11-1 over-under in games with totals over 52. So 11 overs, 1 under. While that goes back 30-plus years, 8 of the 12 games have happened either last year or this year. So that's a long-term trend. Most of the action you're seeing there has come in the past 2 seasons, with 8 of those 12 games, and the Bills hitting the over on high total games. So finally, on the other side of the ball, the Buccaneers, I pulled up an interesting team trend here. When they are favored, and they allowed less than 20 points last game, so they gave up 17 to the Falcons, even with that gift Tom Brady touched on right before halftime. In those games, this just goes back to November 2018. The Buccaneers 19-3 over/under in such games. So it's a pretty significant sample size, playing as a favorite lot recently off a pretty good defensive performance. Next games have turned into shootouts for the Buccaneers more often than that.
I do lean towards Buffalo in this game. Like I do feel like they're gonna play better. You don't have the win factor you had on Monday night, and look, like you mentioned with that New England game, and I hate to say it like this, Vince, but I feel like they're a little embarrassed on how things, how they lost that game. That Belichick had a game plan and it worked to perfection. The Bills still had chances at the end of that game. Josh Allen had that incomplete pass. He scrambled and he threw that incomplete, and then the one that got broken up in the end zone, and then the fourth down they got broken up. But I feel like there's really something to play for here for Buffalo. Not that Tampa Bay's got nothing to play for. I don't want to say that because there's a lot to play for in the NFC atop there. Arizona, LA comes Monday night too. But I just feel like Buffalo, like this is their spot because they lose this game, they're in big trouble.
Yeah, it's quickly, they've gone from the top of the AFC to this is becoming important for Buffalo pretty quickly. With a loss here, I know they do have some easier opponents down the stretch, but as jumbled as many teams there are in the AFC playoff race, they're to be on. If they lost this game, they'd be the fringes, or they might even be out of the playoff spot heading down to these last 4 weeks if they lose here. So it is a big spot for the Bills.
Now let's look at the final game, the Sunday night game in Green Bay. Packers and the Bears. Justin Fields expected to return for Chicago. He's missed the last 2 games, rib injury. Aaron Rodgers, we know he's the owner of the Chicago Bears. He said it himself, but he runs this franchise. But last time they played at Soldier Field, the Packers pulled away late. The Bears hung in that game, and the Packers pulled away. But now Green Bay laying nearly 2 touchdowns here at home. Yeah,
so I'll start with against the spread trend here, and we'll shift to a couple of over-unders. This one kind of surprised me, actually, looking it up, because you think about Green Bay and their dominance against the NFC North. But this goes back to December 2017. The Green Bay is just 3-10 against the spread, facing a team for the second time on the season. I believe that includes one playoff game as well. But facing those divisional opponents for the second time in the season, Green Bay not nearly as good as you might expect against the spread. They've pulled off a lot of close victories in there as well. But you think about, in your head, they're complete dominance in the NFC North, and you mentioned owning the Bears there. But in the second matchups, divisional opponents, games have been a lot closer than you might expect or remember. So now turning to the total in this game, 43 here. Considering the line for each of these teams, pretty interesting information here. The Bears, this one goes back to 2013, have gone under all 6 games playing as a double-digit dog. So, Bears, some teams, we talked about the Bills, they're playing aggressively when they're underdogs. The Bears is a huge underdog, have not played particularly aggressively, and have gone under all 6 of those games. The other side of the ball, the Packers, this one goes back to December 2014, is a double-digit favorite, excluding Monday night games. They are 0-8-1 on the over-under as well. So 8 unders and 1 push over that time as a double-digit favorite. So Packers, double-digit favorites, playing kind of conservatively. Bears, double-digit dogs, play kind of conservatively. So something to consider with the total in this game.
I do remember one of those games, and you do too, Vince, as far as the double-digit dog earlier this year for the Bears. That was the Tampa Bay game. They were getting 12.5. They got blown out. Total of 47. 35-3 at the half, 38-3 final.
Oh, yeah. Their offense certainly did not do anything in that game. That had to have been Justin Fields' worst performance of the season. That he was still in the lineup there. They did nothing on the offensive side of the ball, keeping that game under.
So before I let you go, 10 plays against Sunday, or we're gonna scale back, or what are you thinking about, or is it too early?
Well, I don't try to think about that week to week. So far, I'm through the doing my data analysis and runs on the spreads of games. So still looking at the total. So you're going to see either 5 or 6 spread plays on Sunday. 5 will definitely be in there, and 1 waiting on a couple of different factors as we approach the weekend. So you're most likely thinking about where totals generally land, looking at somewhere 7 to 9 plays this weekend. So.
He went 10-0 last week, ladies and gentlemen. So I don't care what you say. You're going to say you're going to tail off 4-5. No, ride that streak. I know you lost with Buffalo on the other on Monday night, but 10-0 for Vince Akins. Check him out this weekend. Check out his trends as well. Gridiron Angle is going to come out this weekend for Week 14 in the NFL. You can find that at Vegas Insider. Vince, thank you so much for the time. We will talk again next week.
Absolutely. Best of luck, everyone. We'll see you next week.
All right, there is Vince Akins. You can find him on Twitter, SB Breakers. Guy went 10-0 last week. Pretty impressive. And a lot of those games were I don't want to say no doubters, but there weren't a lot of fingernail biting in those games. There was some. The only one really was that Steelers-Ravens game. You didn't want to get caught where you had the under, and then they go to overtime. But Harbaugh, in a sense, bailed them out because you're either losing 20-19 or winning 21-20. Most likely, you're not getting that potential of overtime. And now with the overtime rules that we've seen the last few years, I think it was the Dolphins-Raiders game earlier this year. Field goal, field goal, field goal. You can get 9 points. You can get 12 points in overtime now, the way it goes, because if you kick the field goal the first time and then you, in a sense, match it with a field goal, you can get a touchdown. You can get 12 points in overtime and really screw things up. So, but Vince was great last week, 10-0 on Sunday in the NFL, and check him out again coming up this week for more NFL plays. We're going to look at the NBA coming up in just a moment. That's right. There's our friend. You see him on the screen, the GOAT. He's got the crown. You could be that GOAT. DraftKings Championship Series, DraftKings.com. DraftKings Championship Series is the ultimate competition of contest winners from daily fantasy sports, sportsbook, and casino, the one and only place you can compete in the king of competitions. The best of the best in each domain will compete for series supremacy in their own domain's tournament of champions. They'll have one goal in mind, win the ultimate crown and earn the title of the greatest of all time. That's right, the GOAT. You could be him. He's got the crown. He's always going to wear it. DraftKings Championship Series. Score your seat now. Tournament of Champions. Go to DraftKings.com for more details. All right. Want to look at some NBA for tonight. And last night you had, well, I will say this. I will come out and get the vegetables thrown on me on stage. I had an 0-2 night in the NBA. I was on fire. I think it was 11-1 or 12-1, something like that, some crazy run. And I had the Pelicans last night. They were up 5 late on the Nuggets. Denver came back and tied it. Went to overtime. Nuggets beat the Pelicans in overtime, 120-114. So that was a bit of a killer. And I had the under in the Kings Magic game. Under 222.5, under 223. Could have been 250. It didn't matter. Sacramento beat Orlando 142-130. And the trends I found were going towards the under. I like them. But a 74, a 63, a 59, and a 76. That's not going to do it. So the Kings and Magic, they had the old roll the ball out night in Sacramento. And the Kings won. They had Harrison Barnes back, and they covered the 7. A game that was, 3 at the half, and then Sacramento opened it up in the third quarter. So I was way off on that one, and I will put my hand up and say I was wrong. Now, this one was really interesting, too. I mean, you had a lot of results last night of games in which you kind of shook your head a little bit. The Rockets have won now 7 straight. The Rockets were 1-16 on the season. And all of a sudden now, they have come all the way back to they're 8-16. They've won 7 straight. They got Milwaukee tomorrow night at home. They just beat the Nets last night. I know Kevin Durant didn't play. James Harden made his return to Houston again. But the Rockets have won 7 straight. They won 114-104 over the Nets. Short dogs. The Heat beat the Bucks without Butler, without Bam. And they win by 9 there. That's a good job. Detroit covered at home in an overtime loss to Washington. The Pacers blew out the Knicks. Oklahoma City held off Toronto. There was a shot in the final seconds that went in, but it was waved off. It was after the buzzer. But Oklahoma City now back-to-back wins after that 73-point loss to Memphis. I'll tell you 2 teams that I said keep an eye on as far as losing at home and then playing better on the road. Dallas. They ended up coming back and beating Memphis 104-96. In Portland, they did lose at Golden State, but they covered as 14.5-point dogs, 104-94. So those teams were on home losing streaks and then went on the road. Dallas went outright. Portland covered in a loss. And the Celtics ended up losing a close one to the Clippers. Paul George didn't play, and the Clippers ended up with that win. The Celtics now back-to-back losses there in L.A. All right, let's look at tonight. Jazz and the 76ers from Philadelphia. And both these teams played last night. Sixers won at Charlotte. The Jazz blew out the Timberwolves. And that was a big revenge game for the Jazz because they lost 3 times in Minnesota last year. And they definitely did not want to forget that going in, and they destroyed the Timberwolves 136-104. That's now 5 straight wins for the Jazz. The 76ers, meanwhile, have won 3 straight, beat Atlanta, beat Charlotte a few times. Now 2 big games for Philadelphia at home. They had Utah tonight, then Golden State on Saturday. And I'm going to guess the 76ers maybe a short dog there against Golden State. They're getting 3.5 here against Utah. Last time they played in Salt Lake, Utah won 120-85, 12-point favorites back in mid-November. But the problem was Joel Embiid was out of that game for Philadelphia. So kind of a tough one to evaluate from a Sixers standpoint. Last year, the Sixers beat the Jazz in overtime at home, 131-123. I remember there's some controversy at the end of that game, but Philadelphia ended up winning that one in overtime as a short dog. Now they're an underdog here again, and total of 216.5 between those two teams. Lakers and the Grizzlies in Memphis. Ja Morant still out for the Grizzlies. Now he's in the COVID protocol. I mean, he's been out already due to injury, but now he's in the COVID protocol. But the Lakers, though, they are laying 3.5. LA playing a little bit better, and give LeBron and the Lakers credit. They are 13-12. They're sneaking above the 500 mark. They're getting there. They've won 3 of 4, beat the Celtics by 15 2 nights ago. Memphis now playing with no rest after the Dallas loss last night, and now you get the Lakers. Memphis 1-2 this year with no rest. And that game against LA back at Staples Center earlier this season, Lakers came back and won 121-118 as 5-point favorites, a game that the Lakers were down going to the fourth quarter. But LA ended up winning that one 121-118, and now they go for their second win against the Grizzlies this year. The final game of the night in the NBA, the Spurs, a short favorite over the Nuggets. Denver with the victory at New Orleans last night. As I mentioned earlier, one of my losses. But the Nuggets, they had a losing stretch. They played a little better on this road trip, now 2-2 so far. And you look at San Antonio, they are 8-15. They were 5-0, or on a 5-0 ATS run before losing to the Knicks. And they lost to the Knicks 2 nights ago, 121-109. So now back-to-back losses for Pop's team. San Antonio 3-0 to the over this year as a home favorite. They lost to Denver earlier this year on the road. And they've had a lot of problems with the Nuggets. They've lost now, 6 of 7 to the Nuggets, dating back to 2019, since they got eliminated by the Nuggets in the playoffs. So, and we know San Antonio is not what they were, but also San Antonio is short favorite tonight. Interesting line there against Denver, who is playing with no rest this evening. And you have Steelers-Vikings tonight as the Thursday night game, and we had hit on it earlier, Vince Akins and I. Minnesota, you don't know which team you're going to get. You hope Dalvin Cook plays if you have the Vikings, and still Justin Jefferson out there has been one of the best young receivers in the NFL. And Pittsburgh, give you this number, 0-4 against the spread, off an outright underdog win this year. Now, a couple of those ATS losses came in the favorite role. Now they're an underdog. But Minnesota laying 3.5, 3.5, depending on where you get it. And Pittsburgh, an underdog once again. They were an underdog at Cincinnati and lost. Underdog to Baltimore and won last week. Now an underdog again against the Minnesota Vikings. And look, it should be an interesting game tonight. And you can pretty much bury the Vikings if they lose tonight. If they win, maybe you got a shot down the stretch. They already burned Detroit twice and lost to them once. And Minnesota still has Chicago that, if I'm not mistaken, I just want to double check on this, that the Vikings, yeah, they get Chicago twice. I didn't think they played them yet this year. But the Vikings better win tonight because they go to Chicago next week. Then their next 2, Rams at home at Green Bay. And then they get Chicago at home. So the Vikings, if they could win these two, you're 7-7. You're in the quote unquote in the mix, in the hunt, the dreaded in the hunt for the wild card. But the Vikings, though, yeah, I mean, you lose on the road to Detroit in the final play. Like, you shouldn't be in the playoffs. Simple as that. BetMGM, the king of sports books. That's right. New players only. Bet $10 to win $200 if your team scores a touchdown. Bet on any NFL money line, and if your team scores a touchdown, you'll receive an additional $200 in free bets. Again, new players only, must be 21 years or older. Arizona, New Jersey, Indiana, Colorado, Tennessee, West Virginia, Iowa, Virginia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Washington, D.C. only. Full terms and conditions apply. That is BetMGM. They are the king of sports books. My thanks again to Vince Akins for hopping on, as he does every Thursday, to talk the trends. And check him out, 10-0 last week in the NFL for Vince last Sunday. He lost the Monday night game with Buffalo, but still 10-1. I mean, take that one. I am Kevin Rogers. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll have plenty of NFL look ahead for Week 14 in the NFL on Friday at noon, right here on the Daily Insider. I am Kevin Rogers. Thanks a lot for watching, and as always, best of luck with your bets.